It was a typical Wednesday morning in the city, the sun rising behind the tall, gleaming skyscrapers that seemed to dominate every corner of the skyline. Ethan Mitchell, a 42-year-old billionaire, awoke in his sprawling penthouse suite on the top floor of one of the most prestigious buildings in the city. His life had become a monotonous cycle: board meetings, lavish dinners, high-end parties, and endless discussions about expanding his empire. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. He had wealth, influence, and power. But inside, Ethan was empty. The grandeur of his mansion, the collection of luxury cars in his garage, and the exclusive vacations to exotic destinations, all of it felt hollow. He had everything a man could dream of, yet something was missing. He sat at the breakfast table, looking out at the city he owned, and thought about his life. As a young boy, Ethan had always dreamed of making it big, of proving everyone wrong who doubted him. He had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, but now that success felt like a prison. He had built an empire from nothing, but in the process, he had built walls around himself, walls that kept everyone at a distance, even those closest to him. He realized that he had been chasing something for so long, something that turned out to be a fleeting illusion. Real connection. Real love. It had become apparent to Ethan that despite his wealth, he had never truly been seen for who he was. People were drawn to his money, his status, his success, but never to the person underneath. For years, Ethan had buried his need for authentic companionship under a facade of power. It had started with his parents, who pushed him relentlessly, teaching him that success was the only thing that mattered. They had instilled in him the notion that wealth was the key to happiness, to respect, and to the world's admiration. They had been wrong, and now, as a grown man, Ethan could see the cracks in the foundation of the life they had shaped for him. Money had given him everything, but it had also taken away so much. The loneliness was something he couldn't outrun. He had tried relationships. He'd been married once, a brief, high-profile marriage that had ended in a publicized divorce. His ex-wife had been beautiful, charming, and everything people expected him to have. But their union had been empty. They had both been trapped in their roles, he, the wealthy businessman, she, the perfect socialite, and there was no room for anything real. They had both gone through the motions, playing their parts. Eventually, they had grown tired of pretending. After the divorce, Ethan buried himself in his work even more, trying to silence the nagging feeling that there was more to life than what he was experiencing. It was during one of his routine evening walks through the city park that Ethan first saw her. Lila. She wasn't someone who would normally catch his attention. She wasn't dressed in the finest clothes or flaunting the latest trends. She was simply sitting on a bench, her legs crossed under her, reading a book. Her clothes were ragged, and she appeared unkempt, but it was something about her quiet presence that stood out to him. The city around them was loud, chaotic, filled with the hurried steps of busy people, but Lila seemed untouched by it all. Her focus was entirely on the pages of her book. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure why he was drawn to her. He didn't usually look twice at people like her. But there was something in her calm, almost serene expression that caught his attention. Something genuine. He walked past her, then stopped and turned back. He approached her with a slight hesitation, unsure of how to begin the conversation. He had never been one for small talk with strangers, especially someone in her position. But there was an inexplicable pull, something that made him take that first step toward her. "Excuse me," he said softly, standing a few feet away, unsure of how to approach a stranger in such a vulnerable state. She looked up from her book, her eyes meeting his with an almost startled expression, as though she hadn't expected anyone to speak to her. "Yes?" "I'm sorry to disturb you," Ethan said, his voice faltering slightly. "But you look like you're in another world. What are you reading?" Lila smiled softly, a warmth in her eyes that seemed to cut through the cold, indifferent air of the city. "It's a book about ancient philosophy." "I find it interesting," she replied, her voice calm, her tone carrying no pretense. Ethan stood there for a moment, surprised. He had expected a sharp, defensive response, a sign of someone who had been hardened by life. But instead, Lila seemed gentle, composed in a way that made Ethan feel oddly exposed. He was used to people wanting something from him, whether it was a favor, money, or simply his attention. But with Lila, there was no sense of expectation. She was just there. "That sounds fascinating," he said, struggling to come up with something meaningful to say. "What's it about?" She shrugged, closing the book gently. "It's about finding purpose, even in difficult times. It talks about how everything is connected and how we can find peace within ourselves, no matter what the world throws at us." Ethan chuckled nervously, unsure why he felt such an odd sense of relief talking to her. He had no reason to engage with someone like her. He could have kept walking, as most people did, ignoring the people who didn't fit into his world. But instead, he found himself sitting on the bench beside her, talking for what seemed like hours. It wasn't just the conversation that captivated him. It was Lila herself. She was unpretentious, humble, and had a warmth that made the world around them feel a little softer. In that moment, Ethan began to feel a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: connection. Genuine human connection. The encounter ended with Ethan offering Lila some money, a gesture that felt out of place in the context of their conversation. She accepted it, but with a grateful smile, she told him that money wasn't what she needed. What she really needed was something far more difficult to come by: understanding. She asked Ethan if he ever wondered if there was more to life than what he had, if there was a deeper meaning that money and power couldn't provide. Ethan walked away from that moment, feeling different. He couldn't shake the thought of Lila and her words. Was she right? Had he spent all these years chasing the wrong things? He couldn't stop wondering if there was more to life than this hollow existence he had built for himself. And so, he began to search for answers, a search that would soon lead him down a path he never expected, one where he would have to make a decision that would change everything. This section sets up Ethan's emotional state and the beginning of his transformation, while introducing Lila as a catalyst for change in his life. The initial meeting with Lila is designed to feel like a moment of quiet, unexpected connection, which will set the stage for the story's pivotal developments. The days following that chance encounter in the park felt like a blur for Ethan. Every conversation, every meeting, seemed distant and hollow. He could no longer focus on his business the same way. He found himself distracted by thoughts of Lila, her calm demeanor, and the way she spoke so freely about purpose and peace. Her words lingered in his mind, echoing through the halls of his mansion like a quiet whisper. Was there really more to life than success, wealth, and power? It was a strange feeling for someone like Ethan, who had spent his entire adult life pushing himself to the top, believing that the relentless pursuit of money and status would fill the emptiness he'd felt ever since he could remember. Yet, something in Lila's simplicity had struck him at a deeper level than any of the luxurious things in his life ever had. She didn't seem interested in what he had. In fact, she had dismissed his money so effortlessly, as if it were an insignificant detail in the grand scheme of things. That was something Ethan hadn't experienced in years, being seen, not as a billionaire, but as a person. But despite all the questions Lila had left him with, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was still missing something. He needed to understand more about her, about why she could live so simply and find contentment without the trappings of wealth that he had surrounded himself with. She had said that she didn't need money, but did she really mean that? Or was she just resigned to her circumstances? And what about his own life? Could he, someone who had been trained to view life through the lens of ambition and accomplishment, find happiness in the way Lila seemed to? Ethan's mind kept circling back to these thoughts, and soon he began to form a plan. He couldn't stop thinking about Lila. He decided to find her again, to offer her something more, an opportunity, a chance to step into a world that she could never have imagined. Maybe, just maybe, it would help him understand what he had been missing. But more than that, Ethan realized he was searching for a way to escape the suffocating isolation that his wealth had created. Maybe this woman, so removed from the life he led, could offer him a perspective he couldn't find within his own bubble. A few days later, Ethan took a break from his usual routine and returned to the park. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. He wasn't sure why, but something inside him felt compelled to keep his actions quiet. Maybe it was because he feared what others would think. After all, a billionaire like him, showing interest in a homeless woman? It could be seen as either a publicity stunt or just another exercise in guilt, and neither of those options sat well with him. But there was also a part of him that didn't want anyone else to interfere with this quiet search for answers. He arrived at the park, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. It was a bright afternoon, and as he walked along the same path where he had first met Lila, he began to doubt whether this was a good idea. What if she wasn't there? What if she didn't want to talk to him again? The fear of rejection, something he rarely experienced, gripped him. But as he rounded the corner, he saw her sitting on the same bench, just like before, absorbed in her book. This time, she was wearing a worn, faded jacket, and her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, but she still had that quiet aura about her that made everything else seem insignificant. He took a deep breath and approached her, trying to suppress the nervousness rising in his chest. "Hey," he said, his voice more tentative than he had intended. "It's me. Ethan. We spoke the other day." Lila looked up, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I remember you," she said softly, her eyes not judging, just curious. "What brings you here today?" Ethan paused, unsure how to explain the whirlwind of thoughts and feelings that had led him here. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. About what you said. And, well, I guess I'm here because I want to understand more." She set her book down and looked at him with a kind of quiet attention that made him feel as though he were the only person in the world. "Understand more about what?" "I don't know," he admitted. "About what it means to live a life that's real. Not just filled with achievements and material things. I feel like I've been missing something, and maybe you can help me find it." Lila studied him for a long moment, her eyes soft but calculating in a way that made Ethan feel vulnerable. "You want me to teach you something?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes. I guess I do." There was a long silence between them, and Ethan wondered if he had said the wrong thing. But then, Lila smiled gently. "I can't teach you what you're looking for, Ethan. No one can. But I can offer you something more simple, something you might be overlooking. I'm not sure if I can give you the answers you want, but I can show you what it looks like to let go of the things you think you need." Her words were a little cryptic, but they hit him harder than anything he had ever heard. He felt a sudden, overwhelming need to ask her something, a question that had been lingering in his mind since the moment they had met. "What if I offered you something else?" Ethan asked, his voice a little unsure, but filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Lila raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking. I want to hire you," he said quickly, before he could second-guess himself. "Not just for today. But for something more. I have a gala coming up. And I need someone who doesn't know me, someone who doesn't see me as a billionaire, to be my date. Someone who can show me what it means to be normal again. To remind me that there's more to life than what I've been living." Lila studied him, her expression unreadable for a moment. "So, you want me to pretend to be your girlfriend?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't want you to pretend, Lila. I just want you to be yourself. If you'll help me, I promise to make it worth your while." The proposition hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, Lila said nothing. Then, without looking away from him, she spoke softly. "I don't know if I can just show up and pretend to be someone I'm not, Ethan. But I'll help you, if you're truly willing to open yourself up to the experience. If you're willing to stop hiding behind your wealth and see the world for what it is, not just what you think it should be." Ethan felt a surge of something, hope, maybe, flood through him. "I'm willing. I'll do whatever it takes." And just like that, something in Ethan began to shift. He didn't know where this path would lead him or what Lila would bring into his life, but he knew that he had to take this step. The life he had been living was no longer enough. It was time for something real. Something that could show him what true connection really meant. And in that moment, Ethan Mitchell made a decision that would change. The gala was scheduled for the end of the week, and as the days passed, Ethan found himself in a whirlwind of preparations. But nothing about this event felt normal. Normally, he would have been consumed by the details, making sure the guest list was curated, ensuring the venue looked flawless, coordinating every aspect down to the most minute detail. But this time, his mind wasn't on the extravagance. Instead, it was occupied with the idea of Lila and what would unfold when she entered his world. The thought of her walking into that glittering ballroom, surrounded by the city's most powerful people, made Ethan both nervous and excited in equal measure. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a deep sense of anticipation. Though it wasn't for the usual reasons. He had often felt detached from these high society events, as if he was just a player on the stage, performing his part to perfection. But with Lila by his side, everything felt different. He didn't care about impressing people or proving his worth. He didn't care about the number of zeros on his bank statement or how many Instagram followers he had. All that mattered was whether or not this unexpected decision could help him find what he had been looking for all along, a connection with someone who didn't see him as a symbol of wealth but as a real person. On the day of the gala, Ethan couldn't sit still. He found himself pacing around his penthouse, glancing at the clock every few minutes, waiting for the moment he would pick Lila up. He had arranged for a black luxury car to take her from the shelter she was staying in to his penthouse, but the thought of seeing her again, seeing her in a completely different environment, a world of affluence that was as foreign to her as it was to him in many ways, filled him with a strange sense of vulnerability. When the doorbell finally rang, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He rushed to answer it, his breath shallow with anticipation. As he opened the door, there she was, Lila, standing on the threshold, wearing a simple, but stunning dress. It was nothing like the lavish gowns his previous dates would wear. Her dress was modest, but it suited her effortlessly. She wasn't dripping in diamonds or sporting designer shoes. Instead, she wore a pair of worn boots that somehow completed her look, as if they told a story of their own. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and she wore little makeup, just enough to highlight the natural beauty that radiated from her. For a moment, Ethan stood there, stunned. She was so different from the people he usually surrounded himself with, so unpretentious. But in that moment, standing in his penthouse, she seemed to fit in perfectly. He realized that, for the first time, someone was walking into his world who wasn't impressed by the grandeur. Someone who wasn't looking for the next best thing, the next upgrade, or the next opportunity to climb the social ladder. She wasn't here to compete. She was here to simply be, and that was exactly what he needed. "Wow, you look incredible," Ethan said, unable to hide his genuine admiration. Lila smiled, a little self-consciously. "Thank you. You look pretty fancy yourself." She took a step forward, her boots clicking against the marble floor as she entered the penthouse. Ethan led her into the living room, offering her a seat on one of the luxurious velvet sofas. His nerves were still there, but they had softened. As they sat down, he found himself wondering what she was thinking. Was she overwhelmed? Did she feel out of place, like he had once felt when he was first thrust into this world of wealth and privilege? Or was she simply taking it all in, the same way she took in everything around her? "You know, I never thought I'd be sitting in a place like this," Lila said after a pause, breaking the silence. "I'm used to smaller spaces. Less everything." Ethan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I can imagine. And what do you think of it all?" She looked around slowly, her gaze moving from the enormous chandelier above them to the panoramic view of the city below. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "But it feels like a different world. One that I don't really belong to." He watched her carefully, her eyes searching the room as though she were trying to understand it. For a brief moment, he saw something he hadn't expected: vulnerability. Not the kind of vulnerability that came with desperation, but a deeper kind. A realization that, despite the allure of wealth and opulence, this world could be just as isolating as the streets she had come from. In her words, Ethan sensed the kind of wisdom that only comes from experiencing the world in its rawest form. "I understand," he said softly. "Sometimes, it feels like no matter how many things you have, you're still looking for something. Something real." She met his eyes, a knowing look passing between them. "I think we're all looking for the same thing, in one way or another. A place where we can just be ourselves, without pretending. Without expectations. And sometimes, that place isn't in the most obvious places." As she spoke, Ethan felt a deep sense of connection. In that moment, he realized just how much of his life had been driven by the fear of not being enough. Fear of not being seen as more than just a successful businessman. Fear of being judged by the things he had, rather than who he was. Lila's words cut through that fear, offering him something he hadn't expected: acceptance. The car arrived to take them to the gala, and as they drove through the city streets, Ethan couldn't help but feel an odd sense of peace. The gala was supposed to be an extravagant night, filled with music, laughter, and high-stakes business deals. But as he glanced over at Lila, sitting quietly beside him, he realized that the night's success wouldn't be measured by the number of important people he shook hands with or the amount of attention he received. It would be measured by the conversation he had with her, by the connection they shared, by the way she made him see the world differently. When they arrived at the venue, a massive ballroom with a breathtaking view of the city, Ethan stepped out of the car, his heart racing with excitement. He offered his hand to Lila, who took it without hesitation, and together they walked into the event, heads held high. To everyone around them, they were just another glamorous couple attending a prestigious event. But for Ethan, this wasn't just another night. It was the beginning of something completely different, an opportunity to see life, not through the lens of wealth, but through the eyes of someone who had experienced the world without all the luxuries he took for granted. As the night unfolded, Ethan found himself less interested in the power plays happening around him and more focused on the conversations he was having with Lila. They talked about everything, about life, about dreams, about the things that really mattered. And in those moments, surrounded by the glittering lights and the finest people in the city, Ethan felt for the first time in years that he had finally found a place where he could simply be himself. And that was a feeling he hadn't even known he was searching for. But the night wasn't over yet. And it was only just beginning to reveal the unexpected twists that would come to define this extraordinary journey. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself growing increasingly detached from the grand spectacle unfolding around him. The sparkling chandeliers, the elegantly dressed guests, and the endless flow of champagne all seemed distant, like mere background noise to the real story that was unfolding in front of him. Lila, so effortlessly genuine, was a stark contrast to the carefully curated world he had built around himself. They continued to talk, and every word she spoke seemed to open a new door in his mind, showing him a side of life he had long ignored. Her thoughts weren't shaped by the same ambitions and pressures that had consumed his existence. She saw the world in a way that was both simple and profound. Ethan had grown used to the performance of socializing, to smiling and shaking hands with powerful figures, to making the right small talk with the right people. But tonight, with Lila at his side, he felt as if he were finally experiencing the night as it truly was. They didn't need to pretend, and there was no expectation for them to impress anyone. In fact, for the first time in years, Ethan realized that the people around him weren't as important as the moments he was having with Lila. It was her perspective that fascinated him, her ability to see the beauty in simple things, and her way of looking at life without the constant pressure to achieve something. At one point, a well-dressed couple approached them, offering polite smiles and shallow compliments. The man, a wealthy investor Ethan had known for years, tried to engage Lila in conversation, asking her about her background. But Lila, as usual, didn't flinch in the face of these social games. She responded in her usual soft, unbothered manner, not putting on any pretense, but simply answering his questions with candor. When the conversation turned to her past, how she had spent time living on the streets, Ethan watched as the man's polite smile faltered slightly, replaced with a look of curiosity that bordered on discomfort. It wasn't that the man had any ill will toward Lila, it was just that he had never encountered someone like her. Lila's response was matter of fact, but there was an underlying strength in her words that left the conversation hanging in the air long after the couple had moved on. She spoke of how her past had shaped her views on life, but not in the way one might expect. It wasn't a sob story or an attempt to garner sympathy. Instead, Lila had simply accepted the things she couldn't change and focused on what she could, finding meaning and connection in the moments that mattered most. It was this quiet resilience that kept Ethan enthralled. As the evening continued, Ethan couldn't help but observe the people around him. He saw how they clung to their titles, their positions, their endless pursuit of the next big deal. Everyone was hustling, maneuvering for an opportunity to climb higher, to impress someone who could further their interests. It felt hollow, like a game they were all playing without ever truly living. He could see it now, with the clarity Lila had given him, so many people surrounded by wealth and status, but devoid of real connection. But then, something unexpected happened. As the night drew to a close, the music slowed, and the crowd began to disperse. Ethan had been talking to a few colleagues, discussing the latest trends in the market, when he looked around and realized that Lila had slipped away from the conversation. He spotted her standing by a balcony, gazing out over the city skyline. There was something almost otherworldly about her in that moment, as though she didn't belong here yet was entirely at peace with it. Without a second thought, Ethan excused himself and walked over to her, feeling a pull toward her as if something inside him had suddenly recognized what was important. "Are you okay?" he asked softly as he approached her, not wanting to intrude, but feeling a strange sense of responsibility for her well-being. Lila turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the lights of the city. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady. "I just needed a moment. It's a lot to take in, you know? This place is overwhelming." Ethan nodded, understanding what she meant. For a woman who had lived with so little, being surrounded by this excess must have been a jarring contrast. But there was something else in her expression, a kind of peace, a calm acceptance that most people couldn't find, no matter how much money or power they amassed. "You don't seem overwhelmed," Ethan remarked. "You seem at peace." Lila smiled, a slight but knowing curve of her lips. "It's not the place that matters, Ethan. It's the people. And the way we connect with them. I've realized that I can be at peace anywhere, as long as I stay true to myself." Ethan felt something stir deep inside him, a realization that had been slowly building throughout the evening. Lila wasn't just teaching him about the world outside of wealth, she was showing him the importance of staying connected to his core, to who he was beyond the billionaire title, the business deals, and the expectations. He had spent so many years chasing validation through his success, but now, he was beginning to understand that true peace came from within. "You've really changed the way I look at things," he said quietly, the weight of his words hitting him as he spoke them. "I've been so focused on the wrong things, on what people think of me, on the money, on being better than everyone else. But I don't think any of that matters. It's about being true to yourself, isn't it?" Lila nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "Exactly. And sometimes, it takes stepping away from what's familiar to see the truth." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. He had been living in a world of illusions, a world where success was measured by tangible things, wealth, status, influence. But now, standing here with Lila, he understood that success could be something much deeper, something that wasn't defined by material things but by the connections we make and the authenticity we bring to the world. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For showing me that. For making me see the world differently." Lila smiled again, this time more warmly. "It's not me, Ethan. It's just you, finding the answers you've been searching for." For the rest of the night, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Lila's words. As they left the event and returned to his car, the city lights twinkling outside the windows, he realized that this was a turning point in his life. The journey ahead would not be easy. He knew that there would be times when the pull of his old world, the world of business, wealth, and status, would try to drag him back. But now, he had a new perspective. He knew that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or possessions. It was measured in moments of connection, in the relationships we nurture, and in the peace we find when we stop pretending to be someone we're not. As the car drove through the city streets, Ethan looked at Lila, grateful for the unexpected journey they had begun together. Little did he know that the next chapter of their story would unfold in ways neither of them could have predicted. But one thing was certain, whatever came next, Ethan was ready to face it with a new understanding of what it meant to truly live. The days following the gala passed in a blur for Ethan. He was still reeling from the clarity that Lila had helped him find. She had shifted something fundamental within him, and every moment after that night felt like a brushstroke on a canvas he had once thought was already complete. The constant pressure he'd felt to perform, to live up to expectations, to be more, to have more, began to dissipate. But as with any profound realization, there was also a growing discomfort, a nagging voice that asked whether he could truly break free from the life he had built. Ethan's work continued as usual, meetings, negotiations, and high-stakes decisions, but there was a new lens through which he viewed everything. His interactions with his colleagues, once motivated by competition and ambition, now felt shallow. Conversations that had once been about business deals now felt like hollow exchanges. As he sat in a boardroom with investors discussing a potential acquisition, Ethan caught himself zoning out, not because the opportunity wasn't important, but because it felt irrelevant in the context of the bigger picture he was beginning to see. He thought about Lila again, the way she didn't rush through life, the way she took time to observe and absorb the world without trying to change it to fit her needs. She wasn't bogged down by the pressure to always be striving, always reaching. She simply existed, in the most peaceful way. One afternoon, as he sat in his penthouse overlooking the city, Ethan made a decision. He was going to see Lila again, not just because she had challenged him to rethink his life, but because he felt a deep, unspoken connection with her that he couldn't ignore. He hadn't been entirely honest with himself about why he had hired her for the gala. Sure, it had been to make a statement about the fragility of wealth and status, but it was also because something in her had drawn him in from the very start. Ethan had often brushed off the idea of love, of deep connections, thinking they were distractions. But lately, it had become clear to him that this was what he had been missing. He had spent years accumulating things that would never fill the empty space inside him, and yet here she was, someone whose life was built on resilience, authenticity, and the ability to connect with others without the need for validation. When he contacted Lila, it was with the intention of reconnecting, of having another honest conversation with her. They agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the kind of upscale establishment where the wealthy elite hung out. It was quiet, humble, and warm. The perfect place to talk. As soon as Lila walked into the cafe, Ethan stood up to greet her, a smile on his face. She wore simple clothes again, nothing extravagant, but her presence seemed to light up the space. She had a calmness about her that made the world seem a little less overwhelming, a little more manageable. Ethan gestured for her to sit across from him, the familiarity between them evident. "I'm glad we could meet up," Ethan said, taking a seat and pushing a cup of coffee toward her. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation after the gala." Lila raised an eyebrow slightly, clearly intrigued. "Oh? What about it?" "I think you were right," Ethan said, his voice softer than usual. "About everything. I've spent so much of my life trying to be something that I'm not. And, well, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with all of this anymore. My business, the things I've accumulated, it's just not fulfilling. Not the way I thought it would be." Lila listened quietly, her eyes softening as she studied him. She wasn't here to give him advice or fix his problems. She simply allowed him the space to voice his thoughts without judgment. "It's not easy, is it?" she said after a pause. "Letting go of the things that aren't serving you. Sometimes, it feels like you've built your identity around them, and suddenly, you're left with a question mark about who you really are." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. And then there's you. You've had nothing, but somehow, you seem to have everything figured out. It's like you've learned how to live without all the distractions I've been consumed by." Lila smiled gently. "I wouldn't say I have it all figured out. I've had my share of struggles, and I'm still figuring things out myself. But I've learned that you don't need to have everything to be happy. It's about understanding what truly matters. For the first time, Ethan realized just how much he had taken for granted. His wealth, his success, the lifestyle he had carefully crafted for himself, these were all distractions from the deeper questions of life. They were his shields, his excuses for not facing what truly mattered. He had hidden behind them for years, convinced that they were the answers to his unhappiness. I don't know where to go from here, Ethan admitted. I feel lost, like I'm standing at a crossroads. You're not the only one, Lila said, her tone soft but firm. We all are, at some point. You just have to be brave enough to take the first step, even if you don't know where it'll lead. As they sat together in the small cafe, surrounded by the hum of everyday life, Ethan realized that what he had been missing was not a new business opportunity or a larger mansion, but a sense of purpose, of meaning. It wasn't something you could buy or achieve through status, it was something that had to be found, nurtured, and lived. Their conversation drifted into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as though they were both contemplating the enormity of the change that was taking place. Ethan knew that his life would never be the same after this meeting. There was no going back to the way things had been before. The changes would be slow, imperceptible at first, but they would come. And he wasn't afraid of that anymore. Lila looked at him thoughtfully before speaking again. You don't have to do it alone, you know. Change isn't easy, but you don't have to carry it by yourself. I'm here, and I believe you can make it. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt truly seen. He wasn't just the billionaire businessman. He wasn't just the product of his wealth and success. He was a man who had struggled, who had learned, and who was now beginning to understand the deeper truths of life. And in that moment, sitting across from Lila, he knew that he was ready to begin again. When they finished their coffee, they both stood up, the weight of the conversation lingering between them. As Ethan walked out of the cafe, he felt lighter. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, he was looking forward to the unknown. He had taken the first step toward a new life, and it was a life that was no longer defined by what he had, but by who he was, and who he would become. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself at the crossroads he had feared, yet somehow, it didn't feel as daunting as it once had. He spent less time at the office, and when he did, his interactions had shifted. He began to see his colleagues as individuals, not just assets or competitors. He started to notice the emptiness in the hustle for more, in the endless striving that had once consumed him. His business still ran, and it still demanded his attention, but now it felt less urgent, less like the center of his universe. He felt like he was waking up from a long, weary dream, where everything had been designed to look perfect, but nothing truly felt real. Ethan knew he couldn't just quit everything, but he was becoming more selective about what he gave his time and energy to. He had come to a realization, one that felt almost liberating. The way he had defined success for so many years, by the number in his bank account, the prestige of his network, the size of his company, was now irrelevant. The real measure of his life, he discovered, was something simpler, something quieter. It was the moments of connection, the genuine conversations, the small acts of kindness that held the real value. And most of all, it was about being true to himself, something he had long forgotten in the race to the top. Lila, ever the constant presence, had become his anchor in this transformation. Their friendship had deepened, though it had never carried the weight of romance or expectation. She was a guide of sorts, though she would never call herself that, and she had taught him how to find peace in chaos. One afternoon, when they were sitting in a park, watching a group of children play, Lila said something that struck Ethan deeply. You know, she began, we often think we need to fix everything around us to feel fulfilled. But sometimes, the most profound changes happen when we stop trying to control everything and just allow life to unfold. Those words stayed with him for days. He realized how much of his life had been spent trying to control outcomes, trying to force things into neat, predictable boxes. And yet, every time he had tried to force something, be it a business deal, a relationship, or even a lifestyle, it had felt hollow. Life was messy, unpredictable, and not something to be controlled, but something to be experienced and embraced. The idea of letting go felt radical to him, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. It was around this time that something unexpected occurred. Ethan's company faced a major crisis. A new venture that he had poured months of effort into had fallen apart, and the financial implications were severe. This was the kind of crisis that could have sent him into a downward spiral, but instead, Ethan found himself responding differently. The old Ethan, the one who would have buried himself in work, scrambling to fix things, was nowhere to be found. Instead, he sat in his office, taking a deep breath, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the situation without rushing to solve it. It was almost as if he was giving himself permission to sit in the discomfort, to let things unfold as they would. He called a meeting with his team to discuss the issue, but there was something about his approach that was different. Instead of pointing fingers, instead of looking for someone to blame, Ethan simply acknowledged the challenge and asked everyone to brainstorm solutions together. There was a sense of collaboration, of openness, that hadn't existed before. And as they worked through the issue, Ethan realized that the outcome wasn't as important as how they had worked together to solve it. He saw the value in the collective effort, in the sharing of ideas, in the trust that was built through vulnerability. Ethan continued to distance himself from the world he had once thought he needed to belong to. The power lunches, the endless meetings with investors, the high-stakes decisions, they all seemed less appealing now. Instead, he began spending more time with people who shared his new values, those who sought meaning over success, authenticity over pretense. He started taking walks with Lila, discussing everything from philosophy to the simple beauty of the world around them. He found joy in the smallest moments, the way the sun set behind the skyline, the sound of rain tapping against the windows, the feeling of peace that came from being in the present. There was still tension in his life, of course. There were moments when he felt the pull of the old world, the pressure to succeed, to make more money, to climb higher. But each time he faced that urge, he reminded himself of what Lila had said. He reminded himself that he didn't have to fix everything, that it was okay to let go, to allow things to unfold. And more often than not, when he did, he found that life had a way of surprising him in the most unexpected ways. His relationships also shifted. He found himself reconnecting with old friends, people he had once neglected in favor of chasing bigger deals and expanding his empire. He found that, in the end, those friendships were the ones that had always been the most meaningful. They were the people who had known him before the billionaire title, before the flashy cars and expensive suits. And as he spent more time with them, he realized that their genuine connection had been the missing piece in his life all along. It was during one of these reunions, as they sat around a table in a small restaurant, laughing and reminiscing, that Ethan realized how much he had changed. The man sitting in front of them was different from the one who had left all those years ago, a man driven solely by ambition and status. The Ethan they were seeing now was softer, kinder, and most importantly, present. He wasn't just physically there, but emotionally as well, invested in the conversations, the laughter, and the connections. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove anything, he was just being himself. It wasn't long before he realized that the changes weren't just internal. His business, too, had begun to shift. With a clearer sense of purpose, Ethan started making decisions based not just on financial gain, but on the long-term impact of his actions. He began investing in projects that aligned with his values, environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and personal well-being. It wasn't about giving up his wealth or abandoning his business, it was about aligning his wealth with something greater than just profits. One day, as Ethan sat in his office, looking out over the city, he realized that he had found something he had long sought without even knowing it: peace. He was no longer searching for external validation or success. He had finally found fulfillment, not in the things he had accumulated, but in the way he now saw the world. He had learned that true wealth wasn't in money or status, it was in the connections we make, the peace we cultivate, and the way we choose to live our lives. And as he looked out over the city, a sense of calm washed over him. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't rushing anywhere. He wasn't chasing anything. He was exactly where he needed to be, at peace with himself, with his choices, and with the life he was building. It was a new beginning, not just for him, but for everyone whose life he would touch from this point forward.